Now, Kenya's public debt is at a record high of 11.1 trillion shillings. Out of this colossal amount, President William Ruto's Kenya Kwanza administration has accumulated 2.4 trillion shillings, the most by any president after just 15 months in office. The recent admission by the head of state that 7 out of 10 shillings he collects from the tax revenues goes to serving loans may just have scratched the surface of the grim reality of the country's debt burden that has had the country teetering at the precipice of bankruptcy. In this special report, our reporter Emmanuel Toll leads the lead on the debt black hole where heavy interest payments could point to the fraud, theft and plunder of public money.
The only problem we have in Kenya is madeni. That's the only problem.
We are talking about almost above 10 trillion, about 11 trillion.
I have been approving payments of public debt, and I have looked at what we are paying for. Many of those things cannot be identified.
When you find yourself borrowing from Paul to pay Peter, then 2 months later you're borrowing from John to pay Paul.
Kenya's public debt has hit an alarming high. This explains why there's a high cost of living and why you're being taxed more for less.
As you go to the petrol station, you don't pay for the petrol first, you first pay for the debt, then you can fuel your vehicle. You go to the kiosk to buy something, you first pay the debt, then you now purchase what you want. So Kenyans need to see that the way they have seen their pay slips being hit directly, they need to see this not very direct hit on their pay slips through odious debts that don't benefit this country.
Kenya is in a debt hole, but it keeps on digging. The country's debt has already crossed a historic 11 trillion shilling mark.
It is about 67% of GDP in present value terms. And the stock of debt is as follows. 55% is external and 45% is domestic.
The dire situation ostensibly forcing President William Ruto to single out and explain the only problem that has given him sleepless nights.
And that is what has hidden my head for the last 1 year. Because if you are collecting, if for every 10 shillings you collect, 7 shillings unaenda kulipa madeni, there is a problem, isn't it? Yes, because then you are left with 3 shillings. Kulipa mshahara, kulipa counties, kuendesha kufanya maendeleo sijui utafanya namna gani, 3 shillings. My intention is that we should bring it, we should flip it. We should be using 3 shillings to pay debt and 7 shillings to endesha Kenya.
When I get money from KRA, first I give priority to payment of debt as first charge. Then the next one that we prioritize at Treasury is that we pay salaries. Yeah, because we need our public servants not to be late in getting their salaries. And it's not just salaries. There are other costs that we need to meet in order to keep them working. They need to move around, what we call recurrent expenditure.
However, President Ruto may also have contributed to his own headache if the amount he has borrowed so far is anything to go by. Despite pointing out the excessive borrowing in the previous Uhuru Kenyatta regime, which he served as deputy president, President William Ruto's Kenya Kwanza administration has so far, in just 15 months in office, borrowed more than 2.4 trillion shillings. This is higher than that borrowed by Kenyatta, who borrowed about 500 billion shillings in the same period.
Wengine wanajaribu kusema serikali yetu imekopa. Mimi nataka niwaambie, ile budget tulikuwa naye, kulikuwa na pesa ya kukopwa karibu shilingi bilioni 900. Wakati nimefika nikawaambia hatuwezi kukopa bilioni 900. Tupunguze bilioni 300 tuondoe, tukope hii bilioni 600 mwaka huu, mwaka ujao tutapunguza, mwaka huo mwingine tutapunguza, mpaka tutafika mahali ambapo budget yetu itakuwa inaendeshwa kwa pesa ya ushuru wa Kenya, na tujiondoe kwa mambo ya mikopo ambayo ni mtego inaweza kuumiza taifa letu la Kenya.
8.7 to 11. That is what difference. 2.4 trillion. And in that period, I can tell you, we have also paid 2 trillion from tax revenue to debt. And it is still increasing. This year, the payments are estimated about 1.8 trillion, depending on now where the shilling and the dollar are. The following financial year, more. The next financial year, more. Those are payments. Why does this debt never come down?
Part of Kenya Kwanza's debt include the recent 150 billion shillings IMF loan that the Central Organization of Trade Unions (COTU) has sounded an alarm over. Kenya's owings to IMF stood at 335 billion shillings as of June 2023, and the numbers keep rising, exacerbated by the Kenyan shilling's free fall.
When you depreciate a shilling, when a shilling goes down the way it is going, rates go up, everything is going to go up, rents are going to go up, petroleum products are going to go up, basic needs and basic requirements, basic food will go up, and the general public will stand up against the government, and it will cause havoc, chaos in the country and confusion in the country, and we will not have a government. So if they are indeed helping the Kwanza government of President Ruto, they must stop further depreciation to our shilling, and they must tell the World Bank and IMF that we had a test during structural adjustment programs.
And in a way, Kenya has done a full circle. In the 90s, we're exactly where we are today with the IMF and the World Bank. There was a feeling at that time in the 90s, towards the 2000s, that the Bretton Woods institutions dominated global finance. There was what you call a hegemony of the Western institutions. So when the China came up in the new century, the new millennium, a lot of African countries started facing east because it was cheap. The conditionalities tied to the debt were not significant.
A few days ago, the IMF told President Ruto to increase tax revenues by 806 billion shillings to meet the targets attached to the loan. And with the weakening of the shilling, it will be even harder to finance this loan. The free fall of over 26% of its value in the past few months has already forced the National Treasury to increase allocation for debt by 240 billion shillings.
But imagine, my friend Emmanuel, using the current budget, you need to check. We have a target of 3 trillion as revenue that we expect. And we have, in the supplementary, we revised the budget from 3.7 to about 3.9 because our debt servicing cost went up because of exchange rate weakening and the dollar.
Already the government has spent 517 billion shillings on debt repayment for the first quarter of the current financial year. This translated to 61% of the 847 billion shillings raised in taxes between July and December last year. Similarly, gazetted expenditures show that 6.39 trillion shillings went towards repaying public debt between the year 2014 and 2023. The prevailing situation has forced President William Ruto to increase taxation, a move that has rubbed Kenyans the wrong way.
We are now out of debt distress. Our economy is stable, but the difficult part is still there. We still have to navigate. All we have done is to avoid the cliff, right? That we have avoided.
Tunataka ushuru ishuke. Gharama ya maisha irudi chini. Zakayo awache kutoza watu ushuru. Zakayo ashuke.
The burden is too much. Tuko na watoto. Wengine tumebeba, familia zetu tumebeba, wazazi tumebeba kila kitu.
The more taxes by the president have even earned him a new name.
Watu wakasema ya kwamba huyu jamaa analete mambo ya Zakayo. Heri mimi nikuwe Zakayo lakini hawa vijana wapate ajira.
In full realization of the high calling.
However, it is the 10-year debt spree of the Kenyatta administration that seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back. For starters, for the past 60 years of being a republic, each of the 5 Kenyan presidents had a contribution towards the public debt. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, who is Kenya's founding president, inherited a government from the colonialists that had a debt burden of 1.72 billion shillings, and over the years, the debt has grown almost 6,000 times more. For the 24 years that he was in power, retired President the late Daniel Toroitich arap Moi borrowed a total of 629 billion shillings. His predecessor, the retired President the late Emilio Mwai Kibaki, doubled that figure, taking up 1.2 trillion shillings during his 10-year tenure as head of state. However, it was during the tenure of the country's fourth President Uhuru Kenyatta that the debt exploded, shooting up exponentially and hitting a high of 8.7 trillion shillings in the 10 years that he was in power. By the time he was leaving office in September 2022, President Kenyatta had borrowed a whopping 6.9 trillion shillings.
Nations that have advanced have not necessarily used their own money, especially when they are not endowed with natural resources. They have borrowed from others.
From building roads, bridges, power plants, and the standard gauge railway SGR, most of the monies borrowed went into infrastructure projects that experts term as avenues that were used to drain the public coffers. Kenyatta's first $2 billion Eurobond, which is about 320 billion shillings as of current exchange rates, is just among the loans that have turned up to be a mega scandal, as by the Auditor General's report.
So if there are no documentation to show what we are paying for, then we have a problem there. If it's public debt, and this is one of the recommendations we raised when we did the audit on Eurobond, that can we use the funds for debt, especially external debt, for specific projects so that you are able to follow the money. But if the money comes as part of budgetary support, it means it will go into every public sector entity as recurrent and development money. Tracing that money is very, very difficult. But if we are borrowing for this road, and those funds go to that road, then you can get the accountability statement for that road.
The government is currently grappling with the best ways of repaying the loan that matures in June. It is, however, the 480-kilometer SGR project that has led to questions from the Auditor General and other interested parties as to whether Kenyans got value for money. Safina Party leader, businessman Jimmy Wanjigi, who has been a crusader for ways to address the surging debt, was part of the plan to construct the 480-kilometer SGR, whose total cost, he says, was inflated almost 10 times more.
Here's a project whose contract value from Mombasa to Naivasha was 474 billion shillings. All right? The Chinese government, through China Exim, said they would fund $5 billion, which they said was equivalent of 90% of the 475. It was different exchange rates. So that was 90%. But Kenyans had to raise 10%. 10% there, Emmanuel, you can calculate is what? 47 billion? China Road and Bridge collected 1.2 trillion shillings for a project of 475. That's the contract value. 700 billion was eaten. What are you telling us? That is a revenue problem, we don't pay enough. What rubbish? This is a theft problem. It is a fraud problem. Okay? And it is so deep.
I did a report to the Committee on Public Debt, and they told me, please check on the loans which we have taken recently in 2022. Tell us if we can link them with a project. They were shocked. We could not. We found some ambiguous definitions of the loans, and the Treasury could not tell us what really we were going to do with those loans.
Value for money is another story, you know. Value for money was the project, when you do value for money audit, was the project viable and all that?
Maybe was it necessary to borrow? Why did we have to borrow? Those questions need to be answered by those who are responsible at that time. But me, I report what we hold custody of.
Other projects that also turned up to be avenues for mega scandals used to siphon money from the public coffers included the Aurora and Kimore dams, where the former CS for Treasury Henry Rotich was put to task to explain in and out of court.
You just find a name of why we borrowed. you cannot trace it to anything. You cannot tell what the money was spent for, and therefore there was no economic gain from that borrowing. It is just like taking Fuliza and then you go to the bar and drink it all.
Somebody is asking for withdrawal of money from the consolidated. Just don't, if you are doubtful, don't approve it.
Our public debt was meant to navigate periods of extreme difficulty, periods of war, periods of pandemics. That was the original motivation of public debt, both globally and in Kenya.
Among Kenya's borrowings is a 5 trillion shillings domestic debt, a sum that is as colossal as it has been controversial. From the Treasury reports, the staggering sums paid out as interest for domestic loans stick out. Of the 4.36 trillion shillings spent in repaying domestic debt through the last decade, 2.85 trillion shillings accounted for interest. This is a 64% ratio. According to an anti-fraud expert, Bernard Mushere, the heavy interest repayments reek of alleged fraud.
The question is this prudent financial management? Where you have taxes, instead of using taxes, we borrow to pay with interest. Probably my financial management, I think the question I ask is this: if you have money, taxes, why don't you use the taxes? Why would you borrow to pay that borrowing in interest, and within 9 years you pay 2.6 trillion interest?
It's not fraud because it is market determined. There's nothing fraud. You know, is something illegal. Something illegal. We go to the market every Thursday. We advertise, and it is market determined. The rates have been going up, and it's not because Treasury has been saying that or Central Bank. It is the market that has taken it to that level, depending on forces of supply and demand, and the liquidity conditions in the market.
Mushere, who worked at the National Treasury for 4 decades as an internal and forensic auditor, uncovered a corruption scandal worth 5 billion shillings at the Ministry of Health, more famous as the Afya House scandal, and uncovered the recent 15 billion shilling scam surrounding the Ronald Ngala Utalii College, touching on a former powerful CS. The anti-fraud expert explains how money is siphoned out of the Treasury accounts without a link to the projects.
The moment revenue hits the consolidated fund, to withdraw that money from the consolidated fund is like drawing water from a stone. But there is another easier way of withdrawing money from the exchequer account or the control of the consolidated fund. The easiest way is to create a debt. You create a debt so that you should repay. I mean, when you're repaying the debt, you only require 2 signatures. The lengthy process is bypassed. Only 2 signatures. The PS Treasury and the control budget.
Mushere also points out a lacuna in law that he says is used to siphon money from the public coffers.
The budgets do not contain revenue estimates as provided, as required under Article 220. They only show expenditure estimates. When we looked at all the documents, we landed in the statement of actual revenue and the exchequer issues, which is gazetted by the Cabinet Secretary, Treasury, every month. The purpose of it is to show how much revenue I've received and how much revenue I've issued for financing the different public finances. For that matter, we looked at the statement of revenue and exchequer issues. That's where we found domestic debts. And we looked at the original estimates, which are gazetted there. Our analysis shows that that is a different budget than the one which was passed by Parliament. Because the one which was passed by Parliament did not contain revenue estimates as required under Article 220.
So you'll find that then the scamming begins, because if they had disclosed the revenues and Parliament enacted them into law, then you could go to court and say, what are you raising? They would have bind themselves. But by hiding it, they sort of give themselves a blank check. So at the end of the day, you don't know what kind of revenues they're raising. No, there are no estimates. They're not giving an estimate. Then on top of that, they are borrowing from the domestic market to finance what? You see, if there was any need to borrow domestically, they should have declared in the budget. Treasury should have declared, and the Minister of Finance should have declared in the budget. And that's why the fraud is happening on the Kenyans. You find a very huge domestic debt. But if you go through the Appropriations Acts, even assuming, leaving out the fact that they don't disclose the revenue, but if you look at how they're applying the revenue, they've already indicated what the taxes will pay. They have indicated what the loans will pay and where the loans will come from. And the loans are not domestic. They're all foreign loans. So when they now come to declare the revenues here, you realize they are borrowing on the domestic market in billions of shillings. You don't understand what they're doing. And that borrowing is not approved by Parliament, which is wrong. And two, it's not tied to any project, which is also wrong.
Tell us about domestic debt. Which project has it funded? It is our money from our bank accounts. Who is enjoying this interest of 57 to 64% over the last 10 years? Because I don't know whether there's a bondholder who has been given 64% return on his deposit.
We cannot go to Parliament every time we want to borrow. We go to Parliament once to have our budget passed. And once the budget is passed, it has a budget deficit that clearly indicates how much borrowing we have been allowed. With that agreement or permission from Parliament to say, borrow to this much, the rest is for National Treasury, it is for executive. It can't be that I want to borrow this, I go to Parliament, I want to borrow. No, it is ready. We already have the permission. That is why we have a public debt management office. We will now use optimal mix. And by the way, there are additional documents that also we give to Parliament. The medium-term debt strategy also goes to Parliament and it is approved by Parliament.
It is the same reason serial litigant Busia Senator Okiya Omtata has been in and out of court, challenging the failure by Parliament to publish the revenue estimates in the coming up of a budget.
That issue, the court seems to have danced around it, but with the matter still, it has reached the Court of Appeal. We are re-agitating it, we are re-arguing it, we are litigating the issue, so I hope that me and those who are on my side will be able to have the court say the very simple thing, a very clear thing, that the budget should have a revenue and expenditure. So that you can notice the revenue and this is how you're going to spend it. You are always be spending what you don't have.
However, while Kenya's debt is high, it is not among the highest in the world. The following countries top the global list in the national debt against their gross domestic product GDP at above 100%. Japan at 255%, Greece 167%, Singapore 167%, Italy 143%, Bhutan 123%, United States 123%, Laos 121%, Bahrain 121%, Barbados 115%, among others.
People tend to compare Japan and Kenya. You know, Japan borrows domestically. Most of its debt is domestic. Yeah, they get from their bank, the equivalent of the central bank there. But what happens with Japan is that normally they don't even pay. the government, the Bank of Japan, they offset the dividend they are supposed to give to the bank.
But if you look at those economies, particularly in the US and the UK, the amount that is due within a single year is actually very small. These countries tend to have debt that is stretched in the long term, but the amount that is due, for example, in 2004, as a fraction of the revenue collected, is very small. In fact, in the UK, it's about 10% to 12%. In fact, in the UK, if it gets to 14%, it's a crisis. Here in Kenya, you could say we have comparatively smaller debt than the US, but the amount due in 1 year is so significant.
So how do we flip the coin as suggested by President Ruto?
Rais Kibaki, when he came into office, we were collecting 200 billion every year. Rais Kibaki akasema twende VAT. That is how Kenya, by the time Kibaki was leaving office, we were collecting close to $1 trillion. We were collecting 900 billion from 200 billion. Because mtu asikudanganye ati you can build a country kutumia madeni pesa ya watu wengine. We have to build our own resources.
What is if possible is that we could actually run a balanced budget. Balanced budget meaning meet revenues with expenditure and don't borrow. But we must slow down our appetite for debt because it is not sustainable. The rating now, according to IMF and World Bank, is that our debt is rated sustainable but high risk. So high risk meaning if we still stay more, we could flip now to an unsustainable situation.
That is called should not pay it. And there, Kenyans, there will be no high level of taxation. Cost of living will not happen. Factories will not be closing. We will create and generate enough with money in the private sector to employ everyone you want.
Some of the countries that have defaulted on their loans include Argentina, Greece, Ghana, Lebanon, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Zambia, and have been met with dire consequences.
Can we make our debt long-term so that its effect on the revenue collected is much less? In fact, if you want to know the strength of a country, don't look at its overall debt. Look at how much is due in the next 1 year. Because if you have, like Kenya, 70% of what KRA will collect, it tells you that your ability to pay salaries, your ability to transfer money to counties, your ability to development becomes very compromised.
There are already calls to have a forensic audit of the country's debt.
There are Kenyans who have been in presence of influence and hold billions of shillings offshore. So we need to know how these people ended up there. Maybe they are inventors and we don't know. They did something that we don't know. If not, that money must be brought back the way Nigeria is bringing back the Abacha billions.
I will therefore be presenting proposals, Your Excellency, be it to the executive, to the judiciary, and even to Parliament, on the establishment of a state capture commission to help us to decisively deal with the scourge and the cancer of corruption in our country.
Excessive borrowing that is not in accordance with the law, that is not oversighted by Parliament, who are the representative, we still believe that there is no taxation without representation.
So unless we wake up and link our borrowing to actual economic activity, will not come out of this hole. That I can say without fear of contradiction.
And as Parliament resumes sittings after a long recess, Kenyans will be looking at them with a keen eye to see whether they will live up to their duties of oversight, legislation, and representation in dealing with the debt question. The question is, will they be up to the task? Emmanuel Tok, KTN News, Parliament Buildings, Nairobi.